I would like to welcome the last speaker of this first block of talks to the stage, Karin Bäckstrand from Stockholm University and London School of Economics. Karin, please.
So I use this. I have it. Okay. Thank you so much for the invitation to this, I think, extremely interesting center. And I should start with telling that I'm not an expert in climate extreme or climate risks, but I'm a political science scholar looking on the governance challenges, how to respond to those risks. And I think this is an extremely relevant program to map those risks. And in the other excellent talks, I noticed that in order to respond, we need a multi-level, what we say, multi-level governance response from the city level, the national, EU, and global. And that's where my area of research is in. Am I using this computer?
Yes.
Oh, not this one. Okay.
X.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So the challenge with governance is responding to those risks is that we have multiple cascading risks, not only, as was talked about previously, biodiversity and climate change, but also risks and actual realities of war, and these are amplifying each other. So the challenge is on how to respond to those risks in an integrated manner with the institutional policy and legal framework that we have that are rather limited, because they are usually at the global level voluntarily weak. It's the states who have, there cannot be sanctions towards the states to if they don't comply with it, with one exception in the EU that I will come into. So to devise a governance response to these risks at multiple levels is a central challenge. And I will briefly talk about, I read up some on climate risk and extremes. There were two very new reports. I'm sure you all know much detail about them than I, but I thought that was interesting. Then talk a little bit about the political context of how we should respond, the roadblocks to decarbonization, because it was interesting to hear that you in this program, you will take future scenarios. And I think with Emily's research on this, this is extremely interesting. And then you have to factor in, I guess, what are the political scenarios in terms of legislation, what's happening with the compliance with the Paris Agreement, with the EU Green Deal, which I will talk a little bit about, and then finally end up with Sweden. I had the privilege to sit 4 years on the Swedish Climate Policy Council, where we evaluate the government's response to if we are to reach our goals. And I think that's quite this science policy interface that you also aim to work with the policy briefs is extremely important. So there are two reports I read a bit on, because I was asked to connect to climate risks and extreme, the European climate, European state of climate and the European climate risk assessment. And that was really, very, very worrying reading. You can see how, and you all know this, how we have enormous, Europe is facing very warm years. We have records in extreme heat stress, wildfires, and the impacts, which are enormous also in monetary values. 13.4 billion losses, flooding affected 1.6 million in Europe. It goes on, and of course, coming to the role of the politics, these are issues that need to be communicated clearly, speaking science, speaking truth to policymakers to devise an effective response. So just some very very worrying figures. 2023 was, in these reports, the warmest calendar year We have so many climate extremes worldwide, heat waves, floods, droughts, wildfires, and also Europe is the fastest warming continent in the world. And we have these climate risks, of course, as was said earlier, they impact in a cascade of other areas: food security, energy security, water security, health, financial stability. And we will have impact on so many depth from this we have already. So near-term action is really needed. Near-term action, deep, fast decarbonization. And you've probably seen this figure many times from how we need to bend the curve in order to respond. So with the current policies, we will end with a close to 3 degrees world, and we need to, with the pledges and the national determined contributions now in the Paris Agreement, they are not sufficient. They need to be ramped up and much more ambitious to reach that 1.5 degree target. The good thing, if we look on the optimistic, I mean, we have a global institutional, albeit kind of voluntary weak framework. We have the Paris Agreement, a kind of infrastructure for states to negotiate further reduction, and that is good. But the Paris Agreement is now in the implementation phase, and we face several roadblocks or challenges that we as political scientists look very much into, and that I think you also can consider in the future scenarios. We have this gap between these need for fast decarbonization and the limitation of existing policies and institutions at various levels. And the Paris Agreement it paved the way for this, for states to start decarbonizing, but in the end, it depends on what the states do themselves, how ambitious they are to enforce climate legislation, climate acts, climate frameworks. And also, the state is very central to steer. And what's positive is that we see that many states across the world are setting up net zero targets, plans, climate frameworks, but ambition so far is too low. And then a big challenge, of course, we see it every day in the media, that states are going to undertake this large-scale decarbonization in a time with populism, nationalism, and then we have the geopolitical challenges, the war, energy insecurity, fuel poverty, and what we call polycrisis, several crises at the same time. So to respond to climate extremes, that is a context I think will be critical. We also see, sadly, decreasing public legitimacy of strong regulation due to populism, but also the democratic backlash. Today, 70% of the world's citizens live in non-democracies. My colleagues in Gothenburg studied this. Of course, that has an impact on how we respond to climate risks. And also, there is a challenge with we see now a rollback and backtracking on climate goals. Many states, including Sweden, lower ambition, also referring to that the public won't accept stringent regulation. And we can hope that the European Parliament election in June can change things, but of course, there is a risk that the Green Deal, the climate legislation package is going to be weakened given the politics. And I'm just going to end with some, not going into detail, but I think in this multi-level governance between the global, the local, the EU, the national, and of course the local, I think this is right now the greatest hope for Europe and the European Green Deal. The really looks on a very integrated manner how to make Europe a climate neutral region by 2050, build and incorporate issues such as just transition, that in order to regulate, in order to respond to climate, we have to face the distributional issues, who is affected, a bit like Emily Boyd discussed, very important, who is impacted. And also to move away from this incremental small-scale governance to a governance that is transformational and looking about finding ways to both accelerate renewables, but also increase green jobs and livelihoods. And I have no time to, of course, go through this is part of my research of the European Green Deal, but it's what can be said, it's absolutely historically an unprecedented legislative package. There has been no so ambitious package from the EU. Finally, I would like to, I think since we are in Sweden, Sweden is seen as this very most advanced green state in research. And I think it's a critical case for decarbonization, because if Sweden cannot manage this as an extremely advanced welfare state, how can we demand that from other states? And we have, on the positive side, responded to these risks by reducing emissions with 37% since 1990. We are often listed as a top country on the climate change performance index. We have enormous, even if there has been a backlash of populism compared to other countries, high public legitimacy and support for climate policy. Like 80-90% of the Swedes think we should have a climate, think they are very afraid of climate change. Now, and we have a number of mechanisms for fossil-free Sweden, and also extremely important, a climate act and a climate policy council and a framework. Research has shown that in order to respond, we need strong national institutions. However, now emissions, the government has announced they will increase for the first time in 20 years due to some backtracking of the regulation. And this is worrying, that both the Climate Policy Council, the Swedish, and the Environmental Protection Agency predicts that actually Sweden, that has been an enormous leader, will probably not reach its targets for 2030, 2040, and 2045. And we can see that EU climate legislation increasingly outpaces Sweden's. So this is, we need to look, and of course we do research comparing different countries, how we can bend the curve and decrease, really establish strong institutional frameworks to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Now I'm actually not going to end with more, because I'm not going to take more time. So I just want to end with, if you're interested, shameless self-promotion. We are coming out now, actually in July already, with a book on the politics and governance of decarbonization, where we look on the interaction of state and the states and non-state actors, particularly in Sweden, where I took a snapshot from during this brief talk. Thank you so much.